Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of CogX. I actually thought it was quite refreshing yesterday. Please come and grab a seat. Quite refreshing yesterday that we could get back to complaining about the weather instead of complaining about politics. But I guess we might be back to some of the politics today. My name's Antony Walker. I'm Deputy CEO of TechUK, which is the UK Technology Trade Association based here in London. We've got a membership of about 900 companies, from some of the largest kind of global technology companies through to a big cohort of UK kind of mid-sized and scaling technology businesses. And over the last couple of years, we've been spending quite a lot of time actually thinking and talking about issues around kind of the ethics of that are around the next generation of digital technologies and AI in particular. And for the last 3 years, we've held a kind of annual AI summit where we've kind of tried to bring together a really diverse range of people to talk about the implications of the next generation of technologies that we are going to be, well, we are implementing and using, and really kind of trying to ask the sort of hard questions about what that really means in terms of its kind of human impact, its societal impact. And earlier in the year, we kind of published a short report talking about sort of the challenges and the actions that we wanted to see this year. And our view was we've had lots of discussion about trust and the need to engender trust and confidence in technology. We've had a couple of years where people have been frantically kind of working on kind of ethical frameworks and principles around how technology should be developed and implemented. But then this year we kind of laid down the challenge, which was kind of, so what? What do we do with these principles? What do we do with these frameworks? How do we demonstrate that we can have a real impact in terms of turning principles and frameworks into action? And how do we make sure that we've got all the right people engaged in the debate? And actually, it was in response to that report that our colleagues actually from Prospect, who you'll be hearing from, Andrew is in the audience, kind of wrote a very kind of thoughtful piece, really raising the issue about worker and employee representation in the whole question around digital ethics. And how do we make sure, if we want to have sustainable and responsible transition to further automation and the use of digital technologies, how do we make sure the people who are either developing the new technology or those who are going to be most impacted by it, about its implementation into the workplace, how do we make sure that their voices are really heard and that they're fully engaged in a debate? And we thought that was a really, really good and interesting and important challenge, and agreed that actually it was an issue that we haven't really talked about enough in these debates. And hence, we wanted to put together the session today. So that's a little bit of the history of the origins of this session. And I'm pleased to say that we've got a fantastic panel of people with real expertise in this area who I think we're going to have a very interesting conversation with. So we've got Mike Clancy, who's General Secretary of Prospect. And Prospect, I think, is probably the trade union that has, in terms of its membership, has got the largest number of people who actually kind of work in the tech sector and develop technology. We've got Julia Rhodes Davis, who's Director of Partnerships at Julia's there, Partnership for AI, who's coming from the US, which is an organisation that is really trying to draw together some of the companies and organisations at the forefront of innovation, thinking about how we drive the transformation in a responsible way. We've got Byhovskaya, who is Senior Policy Advisor from TUAC, which is the organisation that represents labour organisations at the OECD, and who's been very involved in the OECD principles around digital ethics. And we have Kate Bell from the TUC, who's Head of Rights, focusing on international social and economics at TUC. And I think, Kate, you have to leave a little bit early, so we kind of put you kind of closest to the edge of the stage. But I think, and everybody else will be here to kind of take questions and engage with you at the Meet the Speakers session a little bit later on. So I'm going to take a seat now. But I wanted to kick off really with a question about your views really on why has it been the case that we haven't had enough discussion, in your view, around the issue of employee representation and worker representation, and really kind of what as organisations, what do you think that means that we're missing in terms of the debate, and also kind of your general orientation around automation and its role in the workplace? Because I think for many sort of traditional people from a business perspective, there might be a sense of, labour organisations often are quite opposed to innovation and so on. So I just wanted to kind of a bit of a general kind of orientation. But Mike, can you kind of kick us off on that?
Yeah, sure. So good morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of the panel. So Prospect's got 144,000 members. Our members are creatives, technical people, and I suppose how I would sum them up, they're ambitious. They're people who want to get on, not just get even, and consequently the nature of the union reflects the sort of people who tend to join it. Now, our people are involved in creating technological opportunity. They're responsible for implementing it, but they're also, as employees or as freelancers, it's the largest growing area of our membership, freelancers, they experience the consequences of that technological change. In terms of this particular issue, I think it's central to the future of world of business, both in terms of its ethical location, but also how it will transform work. We don't come to this with a dystopian view of technological change. We're positive. We think that representative trade unions and others who bring independent voice, not just trade unions, to civic society, should have a say in how society transforms the world of work. Therefore, the companies, its supply chain and so on, that are responsible for driving this change need to think probably relatively soon about how they're going to position themselves in relation to being open, composing their ethics with a view to wider society, and how they'll give the people that are key to their business success a voice in the organisation. Now, to some extent, this is an age-old challenge. Some aspects of this debate are fundamental to the relationship between the employed and the employer, or the engaged and the engager, if we're talking about the self-employed world. And we believe that people give of their best when they're given a say in the organisation's macro decisions, not just expected to contribute at their own micro tacit knowledge level. And I think more people now are, because AI tech is futuristic, it's forward-looking, it shouldn't mask the fact that there are still some of the fundamental power relationships at work at play. And we've been having more dialogue with organisations in this field about how they can fashion contemporary means to acquire the view of their workforce in whatever form it comes, and how that can then be translated into a conversation which actually influences the larger decisions in the organisation. I mean, often this area, you've got to put it in the context of particularly the private sector. Collective bargaining covers about 25% of the workforce, about 13% in the private sector. So it's not surprising that this area is actually relatively untouched by independent collective voice. What the future might bring, I think, is what this conversation needs to be about. Because I think there'll be more of a thirst. People in this space tend to be progressive, they tend to have a degree of individualism, but they also know that there are linkages in their organisation. So how do they express those linkages to those who employ them and have a say in their future?
Yeah. Okay, so Mike represents a body of people who are very much at the heart of driving innovation in technology. Of course, the TUC represents kind of workers across the board. Does that mean that you have a different perspective on some of these issues, where you've got unions that are maybe more nervous and more challenged by the impact of automation?
I don't think so. I think the union movement as a whole is pretty positive, but you asked kind of why workers' voices have been absent from this debate about kind of ethical AI, and I think it's probably because we got a bit stuck on the kind of robots question, basically. The debate on kind of future of work for the last few years has been, well, are robots going to take all our jobs? And we've been very clearly saying, no, we don't think that's what the past tells us, and we don't think that's what the future looks like. The debate should be more about who benefits from new technology and how do we use that technology to drive productivity. But I think we're now getting to the stage where we can start asking kind of a different set of questions and redefining the questions we want to answer a bit more clearly. And in thinking about this, I was thinking there's kind of 3 questions, kind of at least, in terms of kind of the ethical use of AI. And first, of course, is the question which I think gets focused on a lot, which is, well, what gets built? And, you know, what is designed, and is that kind of technology ethical in and of itself? And as Mike was saying, you know, there's many workers, unionised workers, who want to have more of a say of that. There's then a different question about what are the conditions in which it gets built. You know, we're hearing more and more about the kind of ghost workers required to train machine systems. What are the conditions that these companies, you know, many of our tech companies, Amazon, for example, are not known for their good working conditions throughout their supply chains. And then, of course, there's the kind of third question is, once we have this technology, how does it actually get used in the workplace? So who gets a say in what gets introduced? Who gets a say in, you know, okay, maybe we've got a new piece of technology which can monitor workers' every movement as they move around the warehouse. There's still a different question about, do we actually use that tech? And I think we need to get a bit kind of clearer about which of those questions we're asking and the answers that we need, which for us will normally come back to workers' voice, as Mike said.
Julia, so we've had 2 very UK kind of perspectives. The perception would often be that the view in California in particular will be very, very different about some of these issues. Yet at the same time, we've seen lots of kind of examples of tech workers in some pretty well-known companies actually starting to take some kind of collective action. How do you view these issues from your perspective?
So the Partnership on AI is a multi-stakeholder organization. So we do have representation from some of the largest tech companies in the world, and certainly a number of them from the US. But we also recognized from the jump that the questions that we're asking are not meant to be left to the domain of the technical. And so from the beginning, we've also had members from civil society organizations, civil liberties organizations, civil rights organizations, as well as academic researchers. And so it perhaps is not the media's portrayal of a San Francisco-based organization's perspective, but we at PAI really believe that it's requisite that we have all of these voices helping us to shape these answers, because, you know, I think we are at a critical inflection point. I don't think that the future is necessarily an optimistic one if we don't take very seriously the moment that we're in. And because of how artificial intelligence systems are built, what we do now means how they behave. You know, it has a lot to do with how they are going to behave and impact the world later. So our design choices and who is informing those design choices is, I think, really critical, and that's why worker voice, from many different perspectives, you know, this idea of ghost workers who are doing data labeling, who are on a daily basis exposed to traumatic images because they are the ones actually making calls about content moderation. We need to hear from them and make sure that their mental health is cared for. Retail workers similarly have a very different set of concerns, but critical concerns nonetheless that are going to have be really implicated by this moment. And then, yes, the tech workers themselves, you know, ranging the gamut from those who are heard from very often and on the front lines, and also those who are not. And I think that there's a real recognition that there's a huge opportunity that we can get this right if we are inclusive and intentional about it.
I see. Anna, you, in your role, you get to see the kind of perspectives of labour organisations from across OECD countries. To what extent is there a kind of commonality then? Because we've heard quite a lot in common here in terms of the broad orientation towards technological innovation. So you know, not seen as a negative thing, but recognition that it raises a whole new set of issues. Does that sound like your experience, or are you hearing slightly different things, or are these debates at different places in different countries?
No, I think that it depends, first of all, where is the country at in terms of AI deployment already? Is this country already on top of it, or is it catching up to other countries? Already that influences the perspective of the trade union centers and the trade unions there in that country. Then it depends on the sector composition in a country as well, I would say. Because if you have we have members with countries where you have a big manufacturing sector, so they are already used to technological change, changing the workplaces. They've seen layoffs that are due not only to technological change, but also, so they are more prepared for it. They don't necessarily have a optimistic, positive outlook either. It's not that, but they're pragmatic about it. And they have instruments in place. Some of them, that's the ideal case now. But in the ideal case, there are instruments in place and there is social dialogue in place to deal with some of these transitions, as you mentioned. And then there are countries that are new to that, or they have another sector compositions, so they need to learn first. And that's where it comes back to your question, and I can give you maybe a few examples afterwards. But it comes back to your question as to what is the outlook of trade unions globally on these issues. And the outlook is that first of all, we need to learn and understand why is AI different, and why does it matter, why does it deserve our attention more than maybe other technological changes. And I would always say that AI does not operate in a vacuum either. It is part of a converged digital system that we all need to understand as a whole, and not only AI separately. But then again, and that comes back to the multi-stakeholder question, trade unions, I feel like, need to be involved more in these frameworks, to bring in the workers' perspective, which is, frankly, very often lacking. In the OECD principles, we were involved as TechUK because we are an institutional partner. So they had almost, let's say, not a choice, but they had to invite us, sort of, to be part of that. In other frameworks and other principles, trade unions are not part of it. But this is so crucial if we look at where is AI being deployed. It is being deployed in any production, service, delivery process. So workers need to be part of it to tell other multi-stakeholders what is actually happening to my workplace. What am I concerned by, or am I afraid to lose my job? Do I need training, and so on and so forth? So you need this type of exchange, but you also need to bring in my opinion, trade union and workers' representatives together with the designers already to form a sort of co-creation space to say these are our concerns. Please try to put this into your objectives. Please try to put this into your model somehow and reflect it a little bit more in terms of bias, transparency, and all of it.
So, where from your perspective, what are the examples of best practice? I mean, who is at the forefront of kind of putting these frameworks in place? And is that as a result because they've had more of a tradition of labour representation, and they're just adapting to a new set of issues, or is it because they recognise there's something genuinely new and they are responding in a new or innovative way?
I think it depends. You have all of it, actually. You have examples of unions in countries where social dialogue is already strong at the sector level, for example, like in Germany, where they were able to negotiate a collective bargaining deal in the automotive sector that is obviously affected by AI systems, and then were able to adjust working time for the workers and the wages to these new changes to enable workers to take time off for training, take time off to care for their families, etc., because they've seen productivity going up because AI systems were introduced. But here you have a strong sector dialogue already in place in this example. And there are a few other examples like that, where it's the employers and the workers, the trade unions are already talking to one another. Then you have examples of companies that were willing to lead by example at the company level, social dialogue space, where they wanted to be responsible from the get-go, and they engaged with the workers' representatives, for example, on data protection and the right to disconnect. In France, we've seen that as an example. So here it was the company who came and said, we will introduce, or we already introduced these types of systems. It will change the way your members are being monitored, for example. We will explain that to you. Let's talk about new parameters. And then, of course, the company is then, and it's a positive example in the sense that the company is then able to advertise for it and have a good reputation for the outside world to see that they engage with the workers. There is an agreement, everything is transparent. So it's something new in that sense. And then it depends at the national level in turn. That depends, frankly, on the way trade unions are already integrated or not into the, let's say, political system. And there it's not a matter of whether it's about AI or something else, whether trade unions are being integrated. It's more a matter of the system itself. There we see great differences between countries, and clearly in our perspective it should be all at the same level of engagement, but it's just realistically speaking it's not, and therefore we need more, in my opinion, than more multi-stakeholder public-private initiatives to make up for maybe a lack of willingness of governments to engage with trade unions.
So Mike, can I bring it back to the UK perspective? So where do you think we are, from your perspective, in the UK on this issue in terms of perceptions around employee engagement, the practicalities of it, and what do you think practically kind of needs to happen now in terms of the UK market?
Well, yesterday was a good example. I think Theresa May convened a meeting at Downing Street or thereabouts of a range of, I think, tech giants to talk about both the insertion of technology in its next phase in government and more generally. There was no voice of working people. The AI Council doesn't have any form of even nominal independent worker voice. And I think this isn't just about voice through trade unions, it's voice more generally. Trade unions have, I think, a key role in this potentially, if working people want them to. But more generally, there's the hard grounding in any change process of doing things with people, not to them. And if you put us on the sort of spectrum that Anna has a deep expertise in terms of engagement, our labour market doesn't have anymore the institutions to convene spaces in which dialogue can happen, where civic society can have that debate, where credible representatives of workers can convene with capital, who are obviously key to this. We've got no problem with successful businesses at all. Many of our members drive successful businesses. So we've got no issue with markets, but we do have an issue when they are unharnessed, they're unregulated, and they don't have that important sort of control mechanism. So the next phase of change, and AI technical change here, is more deeply troubling potentially because of its scale and scope. It's another form of revolution which can be managed by civic society if we stand back and think. In this country, we've spent 30 years dismantling the institutions in which we talk to each other. And consequently, most of the dialogue is driven by capital, is driven by corporations. Now, there's a lot of concern about corporations' behaviour in civic society. How we handle transformation in the next decade or so, which will be driven largely by technological transformation, will show whether we're serious about corporate governance or not. There's interesting debates about workers on boards. I'm personally much more interested in the broader constituency of workers having a say, not just in the tasks that they do daily, but in the security of their employment, the direction of their organisations, and how they might want to come together and engage to have that voice with their employer. So I think we're in the bottom decile. We're in the bottom decile of employee engagement. We're in the bottom decile of institutions that can navigate these complex circumstances. And I think this sort of audience, these sort of people, if we're interested in it, because we think of ourselves as broadly progressives, we need to think about how we require our politicians and policymakers to change that power imbalance so that there is the space to have that conversation.
So it's interesting, because we talk about a lot about just how technology is changing the world and the need to think through sort of different paradigms, and yet when it comes to an issue of kind of labour and capital, it seems that businesses often fall back into a sort of 19th century view of these issues, at the same time as they talk constantly about the need to engage with the user, do things with people, not to people, and so on. And so there seems to be, how do we narrow that gap, and how do we bridge that gap to kind of bridge across?
Well, it's really interesting because I think the way that so much of automation is going to show up in workflows, we're talking about the integration of, not the replacement of. And so the integration of AI technologies in workspaces necessarily means that you're shifting in some ways workers from worker populations to user populations. And if perhaps this might be the techno-optimist side of my brain. It's smaller than the other one. But I think that there might be an opportunity to think differently about user-centered design when it comes to thinking about the integration of AI systems in different types of industry. We released a set of case studies recently which looked at the integration of AI systems in a steel manufacturing context, in pharmaceutical, and in fintech. And in all three of these cases, what we learned was, irrespective of the industry, we're talking about massive change management, and we're talking about massive impacts to workers' sense of their value, their competence. And so I think that if we think about maybe we have something to learn about from the user-centered design perspective to adapt to the worker-centered design, especially when we're talking about non-tech native companies, which is actually probably the largest population of organizations that we need to be concerned about when it comes to worker populations.
Kate, did you want to comment on that?
I think we do need to think about the incentives in which this is happening, and I think there's a really nice model of kind of worker-centered design, as you say, but I think there are some kind of troubling findings. I was looking at this survey from .everyone the other day, which says that nearly 60% of AI workers say they've been asked to work on a product that they feel uncomfortable with. Yeah. And you think about why can they not raise their voice, and some of that is around kind of collective voice in the workplace. But I think it is also interesting to think about ownership structures. So a lot of them said that short-term profitability was driving the behaviour of their company, and might raise the issue of kind of workers on boards. And we know in companies like Germany, where you have workplace board level representation, you have a lot more longer term perspective of those companies, and you're thinking about, what is the viability of this product over the long term. Obviously the viability of that product is also going to be affected by the regulatory context. So we do also need the frameworks which say, sure, you can design this piece of technology which enables you to monitor every movement of your worker, if you think about keystroke monitoring technology, for example. But actually, the regulatory context is going to be one in which that isn't going to be a long-term route to profitability. So I think the context in which innovation is happening is really going to drive the kind of innovation and whether we start seeing, as you say, the technology that could make work easier, could make it more enjoyable, could make it more satisfying, as well as making it more productive.
I'm really struck that we've got 4 panelists here, none of whom are saying robots are stealing our jobs, which I think is an interesting one. And yet, if we had a bunch of journalists who write about tech, that probably they would all be saying, we've got this big issue, robots stealing people's jobs. So I think there seems to be a gap in terms of the way in which we're talking to each other around these issues, and the way in which some of this discussion is being mediated by the media, where some of maybe the kind of the positive issues don't come across. But I just wanted to bring this. So obviously, in the world of tech, as I know very well, there are some very large tech companies that have been actually around for a very long time and keep reinventing themselves. There are lots of there are the big sort of the new companies that have grown very, very fast and scaled very, very fast. But then the majority is a cohort of startups that are seeking to scale. Many of whom would say, well, we have worker representation from the get-go because we're all workers here. We're all people. We started off as a cohort of people who were absolutely at the coalface. So how do, in that kind of context, how does this issue of employee representation kind of fit into the story of a rapidly scaling company that starts with, well, we're all workers here, but within 2 or 3 years can suddenly actually be quite a substantial employer, lots of people on different kind of contracts, some of whom will have a sort of share of ownership in the business, others won't. How does it work in that context? Because that, to me, feels sort of new about the way in which companies, the nature of companies is kind of changing.
I'm not sure it is. It is new to some extent because of sometimes the rapid, the exponential changes that you talked about. But an area that we're involved in is the creative industries, where there are major players, but then they have a whole hinterland of medium-sized employers, but also a big freelance workforce. And in there, at different stages of their evolution, these power dynamics play out. I think one of the most difficult things for those who have had the entrepreneurial zeal to create their own company, work with if you say a trusted network, which then grows, is knowing the point at which that one-to-one relationship no longer suffices for the size and the scale of the organization they are, and that divergent interests at different points can arise in that workspace dynamic, where you've got to cede some authority. I mean, I sometimes, in my regarding my more comic moments, describe trade unions a bit like your children. You love them until they get an opinion. And then you find yourself having to justify all sorts of things that previously you've just able to say, just do it. So the evolution of a company is a bit like a family relationship in that respect. You get to a point whereby your authority is just not enough because you were the parent, or you were the original entrepreneur. Also, as well, I don't think ownership is sufficiently as complex a notion. Where we represent a lot of freelance members, they're engaged. They may work for many different engagers, but they've got different power relationships in different places. And one of the things that we do with the more enlightened parts of the creative industry is set norms, is set rates, is set standards, is set behaviors. And whenever they're then in those spaces, everything from the personal dynamics of how they're treated and treated with dignity to what they might be paid and the breaks they maybe get are set by those frameworks. So we have to, just as workspaces and the process of engagement is changing, you have to completely change your ideas of what collective looks like. But the idea that collective doesn't exist is a real fiction. There are collective dynamics in each organization. They're either unilaterally determined by an ownership group, or in some way that ownership group shares some of that collective decision-making. And I think this is a space in which that sort of questioning is going to arise more now. Because if this is leading edge and it's driving a future that most of us want to embrace, I mean, remember, people who are affected by technology are also consumers of it. So they can have multiple perspectives on the pace of change. But for me, I think the most important thing is that one person's successful implementation of a tech project on any given day, particularly if it goes to scale, can be another person's inability to pay their mortgage because the job has gone or the job has changed to the point where they're not needed anymore. In a polar sense, that's the debate we need to have, and we need to make sure there are convening spaces in which we can have that, so that we do this with a long-term civilized perspective. And both the micro and the macro considerations are worked through. If we carry on with our atomized approach, I'd say, at Judy's point, I would be less optimistic. I would think that dystopian there's more potential. And I think our economy has more potentiality for a negative outcome to technological insertion because we've allowed the absence of conversations at a macro level to drift so far. You can't put total faith in capitalism. Capitalism will find some of the solutions, but capitalism also has to learn to share and has to be at times humanized. And that's where different parts of civic society, whether it's convening groups, trade unions or others, can make that happen. We have to build a bit of a movement for that, I would say.
So let's dig down a little bit then into some of the issues of concern, where there are kind of problems. Kate, you referred to the .everyone research, where they surveyed people who work in AI and where there was this feedback of quite a lot of people saying yes, they had encountered areas where they were uncomfortable with the ethics of the products or that they were being asked to develop, and then this question of, well, what should be happening in those instances? Now, when you look at a lot of the principles around AI, it's about being trying to be thoughtful in terms of the development of a product, but clearly that can't just be a board level priority. It's the people on the ground and it's the culture of the organisation in terms of how you identify and flag problems. So So how should businesses, what would good look like in terms of engagement around those issues, around the probity or the correctness of the actual tools or the way in which technology is being implemented?
Well, I think we should kind of reflect on those figures. I think it's pretty stunning if 60% of your workforce are saying they're not comfortable on developing the products they're working on. But again, it's about how we create the spaces where you can speak up and say, I am not comfortable with this. And I think, it does come back to those, what's the incentive structure? So there does need to, board level representation isn't the only place, but how are those issues taken seriously at board level? And I think when we think about the evolution of those companies that you were talking about earlier, ownership structures changing and what are the investor incentives is really important. But then it does come back to that issue that Mike was just talking about around collective voice. It is so much easier to raise your voice, and the whole kind of principle of trade unionism is that it's easier to raise your voice with other people than it is to do so alone. You have the kind of protection, you're not going to be singled out as, the one person who wants to stop progress, who, wants to move slow and fix things or whatever it might be. You have to be able to do that collectively.
But presumably there are numerous models for that. There are multiple ways that could be implemented. Or do you feel it's
we think trade unions are, the oldest technology for doing that, and eventually principally say there should be an independent collective voice in the workplace. I think independent and collective are the absolute key. There are some other models in the UK. We have information and consultation models. They don't have a huge amount of teeth at the moment, so they haven't really taken off. And, if people want to design kind of a new technology of independent collective voice, great. We're investing in tech ourselves to think about how we organise workers, how we enable them to communicate when they're working in multiple different workplaces. But it's difficult to think about something that isn't independent. It's got to be independent and it's got to be collective. And ultimately, you end up with something that looks a little bit like a trade union, even if it doesn't have the same kind of processes, branch meetings, paper forms, long debates about rules that might have characterised the trade union movement of 20 years ago.
Julia, can I come to you on that? What's your perspective? Do you think there are other different kind of models, or do you kind of broadly agree that it comes back to a sort of a fairly well-worn kind of...
Yeah, I think that there are, it's interesting. I'm reflecting on a bit of the geographical difference of being from the US. We have I would say, slightly less robust trade set of trade unions because there's just been an incredible destabilization of those entities in the US over the last 40 years. And so there are, I would say, fewer options that are formalized for large swaths of workers who are going to be affected by this. So I think that's something that we need to look at very carefully. But I do think in general, whether it's formalized or not, this idea of independent and collective voice is critical.
And Anna, what are there any examples where that we can point to where this kind of collective engagement has delivered better business outcomes? Because it seems to me that a big challenge here in terms of communicating the value and the benefit is actually showing how this works for the business, and in terms of its ultimate outcome, which is better products and services, better productivity, and so on. Do you feel that there are good and strong examples to point to, or is it still very fragmented?
It is still very fragmented, first off. I also feel like, again, in terms of best practice examples, we also have to be aware, and that comes back to other survey outcomes. So there is a European trade union survey that shows that only 20% of workers in the last few years had been consulted on technological change in their companies, and that does not only relate to AI, but to a broader digital change. 20% is not much, and that's whole of Europe. And Europe already is a poster child, let's say not necessarily here, but Europe in larger sense for social dialogue. So that's already telling us just 20%. So to then find best practice examples where it actually contributed to productivity gains for the company is difficult, especially since the time horizon, I feel like, still is quite narrow. So we can't tell right now if certain agreements that had been made now about right to disconnect, mobile work, the reduced working time, because there are such agreements, but we can't tell yet if the company made more profit out of it just yet. So that's hard to tell, but therefore I can't give you a precise, specific answer, but just in terms of theory, of course it makes sense to have information and consultation rights, at least at the company level, installed, for a company to have workers to be motivated, to not be afraid, for instance, to be constantly monitored and therefore do things too quickly, to being too tired to perform the tasks as well as they could do it in a setting where everything is more regulated and they feel more at peace and know where to go to also, which comes back to solutions such as have workers' representatives at company level, have companies allow for such structures to come about, and does not need to, and we can see that growing more and more also in companies that are new, that are digital economy companies that, as Kate alluded to, operate in a, let's say, gray space in between regulatory arbitrage and common sense. And we can see workers more and more, tech workers also, come together and try to organize, try to inform themselves amongst each other, amongst different companies as to what is that normal, how I have to work right now with AI systems in place. Can I do something? Who can I speak to? And how can I, bridge?
So I wanted to come to this issue around the use of AI and technology in the workplace for monitoring and measuring and generating data about workflows and processes and so on. And I mean, and I think it's an issue that's increasingly coming to the fore again in the media. Lots of you know discussion about kind of surveillance in the workplace and so on. In your view, are there some kind of clear boundaries and norms already that companies should be kind of putting in place, or actually does it come back to, well, it's all about the context? And therefore, it is about having the processes for engagement, because it kind of just matters in terms of exactly how the technology is used and for what purpose, the transparency around it and so on. I'm kind of interested in...
Well, look, I mean, this isn't new. So,
yes.
The idea that all the trade unions do is talk about pay is probably something that is generated by those people we talked about before in terms of journalists who are also union members, so we mustn't have too much of a complaint about that. But take a number of the areas that we operate in, which are high-tech environments. Air traffic control. What an air traffic controller does, you'd be pleased to know, is highly regulated. The working practices that we would engage in, talk to National Air Traffic Services and other providers about, is a constant dialogue. It's about technological insertion. It's about ensuring that there's not fatigue, and it's ensuring about compliance. But that's all played out in a well-ordered, representative process where voice talks to operations and organisation. And there are tensions, but you resolve them. If you use technology, whether it's wearable or in some way use it for surveillance, and there isn't that conversational structure in which those power dynamics are balanced off, do not be surprised if the outcome is a sense of exploitation or an actual exploitation. Because it is capital's responsibility to deliver operations that work for the organisation within its curtilage. What unions and independent voice can do is ask them to think for the long term, can ask them to think about the consequences for safety, for ergonomics, for sustainability. Those things are part of capital's agenda, but they need to be encouraged to put them higher up as a priority when it comes to balancing off against shareholder return. So we have to, in lots of places this stuff happens naturally. You know, we represent people in the power sector. This morning, I was listening to 2 articles on Radio 4. One was about non-disclosure agreements and the secrecy around those sort of mechanisms. And this is a sector which has developed something of a reputation for those sort of dynamics not being a happy space. And the other thing was about the renewable energy sector, the greening of our energy economy and how we do that. Technology's through all of that. Technology's through all of that. So how we talk about it and make sure the fundamental, if you scratch below the surface in any occupational circumstance, it's not long before you reach master and servant. As much as you might like to colour it differently, it's not far away. You move away from master and servant by the social dialogue and the balancing of power that independent voice brings.
Julie, do you want to?
I couldn't agree more. I think that there's a real need, especially in contexts where there's not formalized representation. Putting that aside for a second, I think there has to be conversation and anticipation of impact. And I think transparency goes a long way, especially because it surfaces answers to questions like, how is this information being used? Will it be used against me? And will it be used to essentially inform my replacement, in some parts of the workflows? And I think that that's a really critical piece of this. But especially in the U.S. context, again, I think this is a place where, we see the use of these kinds of technologies are primarily showing up where we see low-wage workers and not many other parts of the worker population. And I think that these are already vulnerable and marginalized populations, especially in the U.S. context. And so we really have to look at the picture very holistically. And I think this is where I see information asymmetry is a really significant issue, both in terms of companies and those creating technologies and their workers, but also between policymakers and industry. Ostensibly the public sector is meant to provide for and protect the public where worker populations sit. And when you have, such an information asymmetry between those who are meant to fulfill that obligation and those who are creating the technology, you really have a recipe for very bad decision making. So I think that those are some issues that really need some more attention and research.
Okay, so let's getting close to kind of at the end of the session. So, but I want to allow enough time for what happens next. Mm-hmm. And what do we need to do? I mean, as TechUK, we sort of said at the start of this year, this needs to be a year where we turn kind of frameworks and ideas into practical action, so that people can start to see real benefits coming from the conceptual thinking that I think has been done across the board around AI and so on. It seems to me that there is still probably there's a gap and some suspicion between the worlds of sort of labour and capital around these issues, and yet it also seems to me there's lots and lots of common interest here, because ultimately, if we can get this right, I think it probably does result in better companies that are more productive, producing better products and services in an ideal world. How can we make some practical progress to that kind of ideal state, and how do we bring everybody with us, both in terms of on the employee side, but also on the side of businesses and investors who are probably still a bit uncomfortable and skeptical about some of this stuff?
So, if I may, I only think there is suspicion if there is, precisely to come back to that, if there is a lack of information and consultation rights in place. Only then suspicion arises, because if you inform your workers' representatives or your union partners about what are you about to do, then there is less suspicion about what you're about to do. And then there are good frameworks in place, in the ideal case, about how to retrain our workers to be able to take up other tasks, for example, how is our data being used, and so on and so forth. So I think suspicion can be tackled and managed jointly. So I don't think there needs to be suspicion as such already. That's one. But then I also think that we need to create more spaces for dialogue and information exchange. Because there is, as I said in the beginning, there is still a lot of learning.
Can I push you there a little bit? But how? What practically can we do in the next, before the end of this year, as it were, in terms of really trying to make these things happen?
It depends on which level. If you can bring sector bodies, for instance, together to discuss the issues at hand in a transparent, Chatham House kind of way, to really discuss what are the issues at hand. We are all using the same systems in the transport sector. What are our issues? What are our issues from a worker's perspective? Do I feel, for instance, more pushed towards driving my truck faster because I know the GPS system is tracking me all the time, and my employer knows that this is happening, so I feel pressured, I don't sleep enough, and so on and so forth. And then the employer can say, okay, I'm sorry, I actually would not use that against you. And then the worker can say, well, can we fix this up? Can we make an agreement? But for that, first of all, an exchange needs to take place. And in some companies, in some sectors, it already does, and there are agreements like it. But in some sectors, there need to be lead industry bodies for driving this process. Now, in the UK, it's more up to Mike to tell us how that's possible. And I know from other countries that such dialogue spaces are being put in place. I'm not saying dialogue spaces are the solution, but at least in short term, I feel like there are information gaps just yet. There are a lot of inconsistencies in terms of engagement by employers of worker representatives. And there needs to be also a bit of a naming and shaming, and this is what trade unions are doing right now at the global level. We are looking at companies that are really the worst case examples and are flagging the issues that are coming up there. And that also, and then we can see other companies that are more responsible answering by precisely highlighting that they are not like that, and highlighting that they are going on a trajectory that is more human-centered, that is more inclusive of the concerns of their workforces. So I think it's that.
Julia, can I ask, what are you doing in terms of the Partnership for AI? What are you doing in these kind of areas, and what are you seeing in terms of the companies that you're working with? Are you optimistic? Do you feel that we're making some progress?
I do
practical things can be done?
Yeah, yes, I do think that we are making some progress. So a few things that we're doing because of the what we learned through conducting the case studies that I mentioned earlier. We're actually convening a workshop and a project on worker voice and worker well-being in particular. This will be a project that is designed and conducted with a number of members of ours from industry to unions and worker voice organizations. And so I'm hoping that that is a body of research and a set of best practices that are implementable and practical, coming out probably on the order of 6 to 12 months. And then the other way I'd answer that question is we started a series of workshops held recently in the US, but we'll be holding one in Japan and then probably over here in the early part of 2020. And this is called Positive Futures from AI. And I think, we all too often are hearing about the Terminator dystopic future that we're all going to be living in, but actually we have a moment of agency that we need to claim. And so I think what we saw in the workshop's design that speaks to the importance of dialogue and the importance of bringing different perspectives together is we had one of the most diverse rooms that I've ever been in the context of AI technology development, from those who are focused on social issues of today, poverty, climate change, racism, etc., and those who are developing AGI, talking about how do we bridge the world that we're living in today to the world that we may be living in the future, and what can we what world are we actually working towards? And so I think that we need to do some work as a community with a very diverse set of perspectives to decide what is the future that we're trying to co-create together. And I think that workers and employers are a huge part of determining that trajectory.
Mike, organizations like mine and Julia's, inevitably often try to talk very positively about the future of technology and about the good things that we can achieve. How, from your perspective, how does that kind of come across? Do you feel that we are overly positive sometimes, overly optimistic? Do you feel that we don't pay enough attention to some of the harder issues?
Well, I think there's a general challenge, not just in this sector, but more broadly, that messaging can be quite different to the actual experience. And if that gap gets too much, and any organization's prone to that, that's when cynicism really grows. Because if the messaging is one thing, but the daily experience is something else, then the messaging is very, very ephemeral and is seen for that. I actually think there should be a positive posture towards technological change, because I think that's actually how most ambitious, aspiring people feel about it. They don't want to enter this debate on the basis of feeling that they should feel that they're going to hold back. We need to embrace it. I think what Judith said about the convening space there, you asked about a 6 month or so prescription. Well, we've not managed to actually sort certain things out in 3 years, so 6 months might be a bit ambitious. But I think in a 6 to 12 month period, if the government is convening a rather more unilateral sort of set of arrangements around this, then we convene our own space. We work with people like you and others internationally to convene a space where there is a bigger blend of voices. And hopefully if that voice becomes of interest to people in this room, if people in this room participate in that convening space, and it gains traction, it'll be somewhere that people want to go to learn about the answers to these sort of challenges. But for me, where we start from is very challenging in this country. We know our economic model is broken. We have a productivity problem. We have a productivity issue which we try to address by throwing time on it rather than investment. We have a gender pay gap. We have concerns about wage distribution. All of those things will be amplified, magnified, exacerbated by a haphazard and unilateral approach to technological insertion. If things like today are important, let's make sure that doesn't happen together.
Brilliant. Well, if that's not a call to action, I'm not sure what is. Look, I think it's been a fascinating discussion. We could continue. I think we are going to continue. So if anybody would like to spend some time talking to the speakers, please do come and join me. Come join us. I'd just like to thank Mike, Anna, Julia, and of course Kate, who had to scuttle away to quickly leg it across town to another event. I'd also like to thank all of you for listening, and I'd invite you to join me in thanking the panelists for a really interesting session, and do come and join us if you'd like to keep the conversation going. So thank you very much, and thank you.